Nice to meet you all. I really appreciate you joining this workshop and excited to talk to you about fundraising today. Apologies in advance. I have a little bit of a cold, so might be coughing a bit and need to clear my throat and whatnot, but bear with me on that. And I have a set of slides I'm going to try to through relatively quickly. Some of it might be a little basic, some of it might be more helpful, depending on where you're at in your fundraising and startup journey in general. But I want to make sure to leave a lot of time for questions. So again, I'll try to go through it relatively quickly. Jumping in though, as you all know, the goal of this workshop is to give a little bit more color about, fundraising, how to be thinking about it, and how to run a successful process overall. For those that are not familiar with me, I am currently CEO of a biotech company called Conception. That company has raised about $60 million at this point, working on turning stem cells into human eggs. Prior to that, I worked at Y-Combinator. I was Sam Altman's chief of staff for a number of years. I was also on the founding team of OpenAI, so really had a good chance to see some of the best fundraisers in the world writ large run their processes and learn from them. So feel fortunate about that. When it comes to biotech specifically, at this point, I've personally raised about $100 million for biotech projects. And really excited to be chatting about this as well because fundraising is something I personally enjoy. I know it's not the case for everyone, but I think it can be very helpful to have an excited attitude about it. And hopefully, in sharing some of this stuff with you, you guys will approach it in a more friendly way as well. So, as a very basic thing, why do you need to fundraise? You, of course, need to have cash on hand always, especially with these types of companies that I would guess most people here are working on. Revenue can be quite deferred for these types of companies and situations. And so it's really important to be able to attract the right types of people to contribute to your company from a fundraising perspective. This is particularly true for biotech, but it also applies very heavily for other types of deep tech companies as well, which some of you on the call might be more oriented around outside of biotech or medical devices. So the first thing I want to just briefly touch on is a couple different types of investors that folks can think about if they're going through this fundraising process. The most dominant source is, of course, venture capitalists. I would guess most of you on this call are pretty familiar with VCs and the types of things they might be thinking about there. But one thing I want to talk a little bit more about is that at this point, there's different types of VCs that are definitely worth considering. Everything from more traditional category-specific biotech VCs that have kind of funded the industry historically, to more generalist deep tech type funds that can be quite founder-friendly, kind of like our fund SciFounders, but also much larger generalist funds that can be thought of as well at this point. So groups like Andreessen Horowitz or General Catalyst that might have much larger funds and consider biotech as a specific part of that, but are interested now in being more supportive to companies at the earlier stages as well. So there's many different types of VCs at this point. One thing to think about for venture capitalists is they're trying to construct like a specific portfolio of opportunities. So it's not just your specific company, whether it'll make or break the fund when they think about investing, but they're trying to take like a very risk mitigated approach across a number of different investments done simultaneously to have different shots at goal and really seeing like a massive return on their fund. Another category I think worth thinking heavily about are family offices. So these can be similar to high net worth individuals, which I'll talk about in a second, but often are managed by a team of folks. Sometimes these are people that have directly, made significant funding them or money themselves rather. Sometimes it's more, wealthy family type backgrounds, but increasingly seeing more and more family offices that are, getting quite serious about backing deep tech and biotech companies as well, especially from uh, a mission-oriented view of trying to create interesting technology and impact into the world. Strategic investors are definitely another category to think heavily about. My partner Lucas, who is on the call as well, alongside Alex, might be able to answer questions on this pretty effectively later. But thinking about some of the venture arms now that are at major pharmaceutical companies like Eli Lilly or Novo Holdings or M Ventures at Merck. Increasingly, these are active groups as well that can definitely be strategic pools of capital that will not only be helpful for the company, but can signal, significant value to other potential investors that might be less keen to stick their necks out on leading around initially. But if you have backing from folks like these, can get them more comfortable with the round dynamics. Um, One thing to think about with these types of folks, though, really importantly, is like making sure there's proper incentive alignment where, maybe you want to parlay this into a partnership of some sort at some point, or, you can have a good working relationship, but there's also aspects to think about, the information you might be sharing on your assets and, or whatever technology you're developing and how that could be aligned or misaligned into the future, depending on what those companies as well might be keen on developing. The last category we'll chat about here as well are just generally high net worth individuals. So there's some similarities here to family offices, but these tend to be, pretty high net worth entrepreneurs in of themselves that really understand the company building experience. These are folks like, Jeff Bezos or Sam Altman, to name, pretty prominent types of folks that operate in this type of way. But there's increasingly a long tail of folks like this as well that are pretty high net worth previous entrepreneurs that are looking to have impact with their capital that they have amassed over time. And so increasingly, I think this is a really interesting category of folks to be drawing on as well if you can get connected to the right people. So quickly want to touch on just biotech markets in general at this point. Because honestly, it's in general always a hard area to be investing in. The capital requirements for biotech companies typically are massive. It can take well over $1 billion to bring a new drug to market, with clinical trials typically being, by far the most expensive part of that journey. It's also just true that 90% of drug candidates fail during development, and you're looking at a 10 to 15-year journey from start to finish, where the investors are having a meaningful lockup on their capital in the meantime, while that journey is going on. And just ultimately, you're only seeing a scenario where about 5% of drugs like really achieve blockbuster status or, having annual sales well over $1 billion. So this all creates the dynamics of why there's a huge squeeze on, startups and why this type of fundraising journey ends up being really, really difficult in general. So one of the ways to mitigate this, though, is to have like a very, very clear narrative on why your company is special, why you will really stand out. So it's obviously important to work on something that has clear, huge impacts that justify the risk involved and the significant costs that I was just outlining. It's really important to have a management team that investors will find compelling, or in most of your cases, founders that are ultimately seemingly high aptitude and capable of steering this company, well into the progression of its journey, and ultimately folks that are going to be good stewards of the capital that they're being entrusted with. And it's also very important to have clear milestones along the way that you can hit and execute to get interesting data or partnerships, things like that, to like keep driving that momentum for the companies to be succeeding and progressing over time. So yeah, that's just all true in a normal environment, but you guys probably are fairly aware that the last couple of years have been really tough in the biotech market. There's definitely been a strong dislocation between, how the general public markets are doing and how, biotech as a whole has been performing in the same period. Things got really bubbly during COVID, partially because of super low interest rates, essentially zero interest rates. So there was a lot of money sloshing around, and also there was so much focus on biotech and life sciences due to the pandemic and the types of technologies that were important to consider for how to ameliorate the situation with the pandemic. So there was a lot of excitement around biotech's potential, and things just honestly got too frothy. A lot of companies were getting funded that shouldn't have been at valuations that were crazy and amounts of capital that were crazy. So there's definitely been this strong retrenchment in that period since. This are just some screenshots and like some biotech company examples I took a couple months ago, but you're seeing in this like short-term period companies down, like Caribou Biosciences down almost 87% since they IPO'd, Ginkgo down 98%, 23andMe down 96%. So these are the types of dynamics that uh may not directly influence our companies, but for the overall fundraising environment, it definitely has impact in people's heads. Like even though too, these are much later stage companies and in the public markets, that sentiment definitely trickles down ultimately and affects how people are thinking about startups as well, because it's always important in people's minds to think, A, what's a fair valuation? What's market appetite for these types of things? And then investors also have to think about, in the next stages of these companies, given they're so capital intensive, like who upstream is going to be able to fund them if you're not a firm that can kind of take things all the way, which there are very, very few that can. So all to say, very important to keep the public market sentiment and dynamics in mind when considering these types of things. And yeah, it's also one thing. It's true that this could continue to evolve over, the coming months and years for sure. So it's important to like continue to monitor this and see how things continue to change over time. This is just kind of, building on that again. There's cycles where there's trough periods, there's cycles where there's really high periods. There's some investors that are going to be kind of immune to these types of dynamics and just be equipped to thinking about things long term. But many investors are like very, very herd-like. And so when they see these, boom and bust cycles, they react accordingly and can panic or get overheated in these high points. So it's important to just like try and stay level-headed throughout all of this and do the best you can. So now talking a little bit more about what a good fundraise could specifically look like on an individual basis, in terms of like what you can actually control. Starting with when to think about fundraising. So some of you might not yet have started your companies, others of you might have been going for a while at this point. One general good rule of thumb is it's most ideal to start a fundraise process when you have over 12 months of runway. So you're in like a really great position of strength. But at the least, it's definitely good, I would say, to start a fundraise with at least 6 months of runway. This is because a fundraise process can take a quite significant period of time. Um, some of these can easily go on for over 6 months in terms of conversations you're having with people and false starts and progressions that can become, trickier depending on how momentum is going with other investors you're talking to simultaneously. And the weaker of a cash position or runway position you have, the easier it is for investors to also look at you as like a kind of adverse situation where, at the least you might end up with like a much lower valuation, but also just have concern of whether this is something really worth backing if it feels like, it's approaching, kind of that point where it could not be able to survive. So this is one of those types of things that like is always very helpful to balance simultaneously. Though, full awareness, not everyone always has the luxury to be thinking about this. And at a very basic level, like fundraising is a series of conversations where you're selling investors on the idea of what you're working on. Sometimes these can be really quick. I've personally gotten some investors for my company just over an email interaction where I never actually even spoke with the people. These have been, multiple $100,000 checks in some of these instances. And other times I've definitely seen it firsthand that it can take many, many months and grinding and many touch points with individual investors. Like also important to like have like a very large funnel going on simultaneously while doing this. So it's just a very unpredictable process going into it, and especially in a market environment like this, like it's hard to count on one thing versus another. So you need to be prepared for a long journey for sure. Also, ideally too, it's great if you've had some touch points with potential investors over time. That just gives them a stronger data set to, have confidence in you and what you're working on and see how you're executing over a period of time. Again, especially if you're starting out, this may not be an opportunity most people can have, but especially in thinking of future fundraisers and kind of seeding the ground, you don't want to spend a tremendous amount of time just, having touch points with investors for the sake of it, but it can be good to build that relationship over time. And ultimately, again, in the spirit of it being like a sales process, you want to have like a very large funnel at the start of this fundraising process. So ideally, try and identify at least 50 potential investors after researching, portfolios that that funds might have in terms of looking at their companies on their websites and seeing that there could be matches with what you're doing. Like try to make a list of that, try and figure out like high net worth individuals who might be interested in the specific problems you're trying to tackle as well. And then ideally get warm introductions to these people if possible, but definitely don't be shy about just cold reaching out either. I personally have had a tremendous amount of luck with just cold outreach in my career and can find it to be a very, very effective tool, especially when it's a very personalized email that's very thoughtful. It's not helpful to just send a mass outreach email that, is clearly much more generic. We get a lot of those at SciFounders, and we tend to just ignore those. But a cold email that's like thoughtful and specific to the person you're reaching out to can still be a very effective way to get your foot in the door. And one thing to always keep in mind as well while going through a fundraising process is it's the investor's job to try and find reasons to say no. Um, Basically, like find ways to just get to a quick reason to reject you. So I find it very helpful to, in general, be paranoid throughout the process of conversations for these types of things. Um, you know, think about it as like good customer service, essentially, where like you want to get back to the investors when they have questions for you or follow-ups in like a very short amount of time. You don't want to like have it wait and linger for multiple days, even multiple hours, like, if possible, if you can get back quickly and just even say like, hey, let me, think on this, talk with my team and get back to you on these questions. Like just having those types of touch points of like frequent communication can be quite valuable in this type of process. And then you also want to like try and make sure like throughout this process with any individual investor, you're continuing to manufacture momentum. So, excuse me, maybe that means you're seeing progress with other investors that you can share as a touch point. Maybe, um, yeah, obviously, if you're able to like close some money in the interim or get more commits, that's like helpful momentum as well. But trying to create a dynamic where it feels like things are moving in this process, not just with an individual investor, but also with other people you might be talking to, ends up being very favorable versus again, like feeling like you might be more of like an adverse type of company that they'll really have to stick their neck out for. And so, what are investors ultimately looking for? A company that has very high potential for extreme impact and a clear market to capture. So, I mean, in short, like a company that can be very, very valuable. In our case, for SciFounders, for example, like we're really trying to look for companies that we can imagine being, $10 billion plus company outcomes in the end in an absolute grand slam scenario. To be clear, is there the expectation that that's going to happen? No, but it's very helpful if you can imagine a scenario where a company has that massive, massive potential for impact. Oh, worth saying as well, there are other types of investors, if like you don't fit that criteria, that might be looking for, smaller base hit type of outcomes that are shorter term and more potentially risk mitigated. Like often like single asset traditional biotech investors might fit that category. But many, many investors cast a wider net are looking for this kind of like massive, massive impact and potential. Investors are also looking for very strong founders and management teams that they think can build out the right overall team to really execute on these companies and really reach their potential. Again, this ends up being like a huge limiting factor, especially in biotech, that where there's often not the strongest founders or team around the table for something that could be a promising technology, and that leads a lot of people to be less excited about that. Although, if that fits the case, if for example, there's not a team around a specific company asset, there are other types of funds, again, amongst traditional biotech folks that can take on an asset and build out the company internally. So that can be an option if building out the company yourself doesn't necessarily seem to you like the best overall possibility. Again, on the sense of like trying to run a good process, like excellent communication is something investors look for in shorthand as well. Um, Probably, we're doing this fellowship program for SciFounders where we're going to kick off a cycle in a couple weeks. We expect we'll get, call it 700 or 800 applications for that. I would guess like half of that we're going to end up throwing out just because, people haven't been able to boil down and clearly communicate what they're working on, in terms of what makes it special, like why it's an opportunity really going after. Um, why they're the team to be doing this appropriately and kind of the pitfalls that they might be facing or what competitors are doing. So like having like a very clear, crystal, concise explanation about everything to do with your company can end up being like a very, very valuable thing. And again, this is a heuristic for having confidence that for this type of company, when fundraising is so important, you'll be able to do this in the future as well for additional funding potential, and also likewise pull in the right types of people to surround yourself around the table to build out this type of company. And then ultimately, as you make more progress, investors are really looking for that sense that you actually are making consistent progress towards major milestones. So actually achieving data milestones that you set out and communicate you're going to be hitting based off the funding you're given, or securing partnerships that might make sense, or things along those types of lines where it feels like the company is ultimately making discernible progress, quarter over quarter, or at the least year over year. So, shifting gears a little bit, what happens once you get a commitment in a fundraising process? Hopefully at some point someone's gonna give you a yes as a lead investor. The lead investor is often the one that's going to be negotiating with the company to set the terms for investment, and sometimes there's multiple leads, sometimes it's just one person. But ultimately, if you get into the position where there's investor interest, on the investor side of this table, the situation can be a bit zero sum in that a lot of investors have specific ownership targets they're trying to hit with the company. So that can make it so there's not necessarily room for everyone around the table, and you have to end up making some decisions about who you actually want to bring on as your investors, if you're fortunate enough to be in that type of position. And so everything in theory is negotiable in these types of negotiation processes. Really depends on how attractive you are as a company, and what types of investors around the table you are in terms of being like how founder friendly they are, or maybe they aren't the friendliest investors ultimately. Like these are things definitely to be paying attention to. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, you're choosing investors where it is kind of like getting married in some sense. People like to say it's going to be a very long-term relationship, and ideally, you want people around the table that can be helpful and aren't going to be a pain at the least. And often those types of dynamics are worth thinking about beyond just who's going to give you the highest valuation overall. That said, as well, like most investors at like the very early stages, I like don't think are probably going to be like that helpful, especially when most of you are probably working on companies that are like super insularly R&D based. And so, you know, optimize for sure, at the least for getting investors that are not going to be a pain or a hassle, or if you really feel like they're investors that, can be helpful based off of your interactions with them, that's one thing. But just be sober-minded as well that like probably even once you get investment, the early stages of these companies are still going to be like pretty, driven around what you are doing internally rather than investors having like a huge influence on the trajectory of your company. So once you've chosen investors, you've gotten the investment, that's great. You got to then continue to work on having a great relationship with the investors over time, especially your major investors, to like make sure you're well aligned into the future. Good communication, again, stays very important. You want to make sure you keep them up to date with important progress or milestones, as well as, be honest and let them know if you're having issues that come up as well. And, at least give them the opportunity to see if they can be helpful or have any ideas that, might jog something for you as well. Some people like keep investors abreast with regular meetings or sending email updates. Other investors might be like sort of passive and not really care about that type of thing. So it just ultimately depends a lot. And yeah, just try to get a feel for your investors on an individual basis, what can make most sense. Often this doesn't happen at like a pre-seed or seed stage, but it's also possible like some investors may want to join your board, especially if you're raising from venture capitalists or strategic investors. They might want to have this inside information. Be really mindful about this. I think a lot of people don't fully weigh how much impact having an investor on your board can have over time. And, it's not always the case that even if you start aligned in initial years, you're going to stay aligned into the long term. So really try to feel good about the investors you might put on your board if that's a requirement. Maybe even, uh, yeah, like think deeply about like if the board actually makes sense at all, or try to push back on it. Um, but yeah, it just generally varies quite a bit. And so obviously like bad investor or bad relations with investors is quite not ideal as well. So again, just to underscore, like try to get investors that you really think you will like and can get along with into the long term. rather than just valuation maximizing if you're in that position. So really, really quickly, outside of fundraising, there's a couple other sources of funding that you can think about. One we touched on a little bit here, but partnerships are definitely part of it. Um, this can be, again, beyond just strategic investors, a really, really valuable signal to other investors, like to secure a partnership from a major pharmaceutical company, just to have a sign of good faith that, hey, this company is really working on something that people value and want, and it just de-risks the whole thing in general. Often these can come with some type of licensing agreement with a large pharmaceutical company, where they might pay a portion of development costs. Often in those types of cases as well, you might be, giving one of your assets away in terms of the economics and a pretty significant portion. But if you're the type of platform company that might end up with multiple assets, it can still be, definitely a very valuable, worthwhile thing to do, just in terms of like how the funding brought in non-dilutively can, both again signal to other investors, but also give you a non-dilutive runway to keep making progress on everything you're doing. And then grants can still be significant for companies as well. Like definitely like some of the companies we funded have been able to get pretty significant grants at this point, like where they haven't had to dilute themselves. They've been able to, really operate scrappily and, maintain a lot more control and ownership in the company. So these can be great things to consider. Um, my company Conception, for example, is not a great one for grants just because we don't qualify for a lot of things based off of what you're working on. So that might be true for some of the things you guys are working on as well. But uh, yeah, depending on what you're working on, it can be a great thing to pursue. There's both government grants and then there's also nonprofit private foundation grants that folks can sometimes consider as well. And ultimately, just keep in mind, like the goal of these companies is to actually have real products that are generating revenue, in the sense of being able to like fund future R&D for other programs and just achieve self-sustainability into the long term. So even though this idea might, for most of you, be like very, very deferred into the future, remember as well that this is the ultimate goal, and all of this fundraising dynamics are like cross this chasm to hopefully get to this point eventually, and then be more in control of your own destiny. So I just want to end on like before Q&A, like on a quick plug for our own fund, SciFounders. We invest in pre-seed to seed primarily. Sometimes we do Series A as well. And we really try to be as helpful as possible given our own operational backgrounds. In my case, with my company Conception, which Alex has helped with at points as well, and my partner Lucas started Mammoth Biosciences, to just, yeah, with all of our experiences, be able to be more operationally helpful, we hope, into the long term. And then, yeah, I mentioned this already, but on February 1st, we're going to launch a new open application round of our SciFounder Fellowship Program, which is meant to be a bit more resource intensive in terms of the types of help we give to teams we fund through that. Often it's like graduate students or postdocs who are, applying for funding through that mechanism. We'll give you up to $1 million. It's meant to be a pretty quick, streamlined process to get to those types of decisions. So if you think that can apply well for you, feel free to apply. And in general, feel free to, email us after this, and we're happy to follow up with more, support or advice or anything like that. So yeah, with that, I'm going to stop the presentation part, and I think probably in many more ways will be interesting to get guys' specific questions.
Cool. Yeah. We got a lot of questions over email already, so we're gonna do it in order that we can go through those first. I try to sort them a little bit, and then we can maybe also go through the chat, and after that, people can raise their hands if still time. But yeah, I think one question I got pretty often, and probably one of the ones most people think about is how can smaller companies or founder-led bio companies really compete with like these industry veterans or larger funds putting like millions and millions and hundreds and millions of dollars in like companies at like a seed Series A stage. How should people think about this concept, and how should they like think about like being able to compete with funding here?
Yeah, so I don't think many people realize like how many of the big biotech companies have been started on very small amounts of capital. Like even examples like Genentech were inflation adjusted. It was only like about, $1 to $2 million in terms of its initial funding capital to get started in terms of everything it ended up building. There's lots of examples like this where small amounts of money can go quite far. I think like a lot of the funds, like as they've, matured over time, they have these incentives where they need to be like deploying large amounts of capital simultaneously based off the very, very large funds they've developed. And sometimes that can make a lot of sense to start anywhere from, a company with like 30 to multiple hundreds of millions of dollars. But I think a surprising amount of time you can actually start to make initial progress over a very small amount of capital, depending on what you're working on. And, scoping initial milestones that fit that allow you to get started, establish yourself as a real company, and make progress from there. That can be a really powerful thing to then unlock other classes of investors and later stage investors as well that might become more comfortable over time to write larger checks into what you're working on based off the momentum.
Cool. Another question I think important to answer is what are the main red flags investors look for during like an initial diligence screen?
Yeah, so a variety of things. A simple one again is like, does it seem like a team that can actually build this over time and like actually make great progress, or are there concerns with how they're thinking about things in ways that are not ideal? Um, yeah, so that goes back again to like this idea of like being able to communicate well, to like really be able to illustrate that this is a company with high potential. Another aspect, honestly, is like, are you working on an idea that actually seems valuable and differentiated and something that's going to stand out, not just in that current round of investment, but into the future? This is a case for us too, where like a lot of the time we end up seeing companies that are like quite derivative from one another. And that ends up holding those companies back, honestly, both with us and with other potential investors. Because, when these companies are super, super capital intensive, in many cases, if, you're essentially following something that other people are already, well down that trodden path in terms of, having assets that are further along and having raised massive amounts of capital and built giant teams or even medium-sized teams, it can be less attractive to feel like, hey, the world needs another one of these. So that's something I think is really important to be honest with yourself as well. Like, how much do you stand out or not? And if you're not standing out that heavily, um, or not coming across that way, like trying to like think very clearly as to what makes your company special and figure out how to communicate that super well.
Right. I think another thing important to touch base on is how VCs really think about returns in biotech when, yeah, clinical trials can take over a decade. Yeah, how do they expect returns to look like?
Yeah, super varies by the individual fund. Like some funds, honestly, are going out to communicate to their investors that one of the benefits of biotech is that you can, in theory, achieve liquidity faster. Like there are often acquisitions after, say, phase one data for something, or companies going public fairly early on. And some folks are like designing their funds around those types of potentials and looking more for like base hits that can happen quickly, basically. Other funds are really looking for companies that can be, enduring generational companies that will be, standouts in of themselves. And yeah, like really want to be backing the next like Regeneron or Vertex or Intuitive Surgical, things like that. So is important to scope your audience a little bit in terms of what VC specifically you're dealing with. And then, yeah, you can tailor the story a little bit in terms of like how you see the potential playing out over time for your specific company relative to, the types of outcomes they're looking for. But, no one's going to not be excited at, an opportunity that seems potentially achievable that can be a massive type of outcome in the end.
Another question we got, is small amount of funding, for example, 250K or maybe 500K, even enough for biotech to get started, or would it make more sense to wait until they have more funding available to hit really critical milestones?
Yeah, I'm definitely losing my voice a little bit, so I'm going to invite my partner Lucas to, chime in a bit as well.
Yeah, I think it definitely can be. I think this is a common misconception is that similar to what Matt said earlier, is that biotechs require a tremendous amount of capital from the get-go. But yeah, when you look at the history of successful biotechs, it really is companies that started with, hundreds of thousands of dollars or single-digit millions of dollars, not $100 million. So it varies a lot company by company, but I think if you really, put pen to paper and think about what can you accomplish with 500K, typically there are significant de-risking milestones that would allow you to have a markup for the next round. So personal opinion, absolutely yes, you can. In many cases, you can do a lot with small amounts of capital, and you don't necessarily need to wait for a mega round.
Cool. Another question we got frequently: what are common things that are overlooked in pitch decks that could really make it stand out or could be improved on?
I'm going to take this one, Matt. I'll spare your voice. The biggest thing we see in pitch decks, especially for new founders or first-time founders, is just being far too technical. I think you really should see the pitch deck as a pretty general purpose introductory material that's really trying to get you to that next meeting. And so, although being a scientist myself, although we all are super excited about whatever we spent our lives researching, really trying to distill it and doing kind of the sometimes we call it like the mom test or something. Like if you go and, unless your mom's a scientist, if you go and present this to your mom, can she understand what you're actually what the value of the company is going to be? Even for very biotech specific funds, I think they want that. They're flipping through this very, very quickly. So they need simple stuff that they just are going to say, does this go in the trash heap or do I want to have another meeting? So that's probably the biggest thing that's missing, is just a really clear distillation of what the value of the company is. And then otherwise, I think there's pretty standard boilerplate flow that you have the team and all the standard slides.
Cool. I'm trying to take some questions out of the chat, so you're not ignoring those. Question around business model right now, platform versus asset-centric companies, probably because people seeing how to shift more into asset-focused companies or investors getting more excited about assets. So curious how we think about this. What would be the ideal business model for a company that's just getting started? Should they more focus on a platform or should they really highlight assets more?
I take this one. I think you're seeing a shift in biotech from platform to more asset focused. But these things come in waves and it'll continue to cycle. So I think right now, one, you should be responsive to whatever the investors kind of current sentiment is, and if the investor says we really just care about your pipeline, don't talk for 30 minutes about how cool your technology is. Talk about what products you're going to build out of it. But the reality is still a lot of investors, despite the current sentiment, still kind of want to have their cake and eat it too. So really, I think the most successful platforms are still focused on what are those products that are spinning out of it. But it's really just kind of what you're going to lead with, whether it's platform or technology focused. And being very clear, even if you are technology focused company or platforms focused company, being clear about what your products are is going to be important for almost every investor.
Well, I think there's another one for you, Lucas. How crucial is intellectual property for securing funding?
It can be pretty valuable early on. Early stage investors, frankly, there's just not that much to go off of, right? And that's one reason that, as Matt pointed out, a lot of the assessment is on the team, right? It's assessing you, seeing, are you a serious person? Are you working well with your co-founders? And so when there are tangible things that can go along with the fundraise, whether it's small amounts of data that may be coming out of early research or out of an institution or IP, that can be pretty valuable. But I do think this can get, it's often more valuable for generalists, I'd say, and less for the biotech-specific investors, unless it's a really, really strong patent. But I wouldn't just file patents for the sake of having a patent. It really should be, you have something core that is going to broadly be useful for your future programs. Because the reality is patent portfolios mature over time, and what really matters for protecting your products at the end of the road is things that are typically more close to whatever that final product is, and usually early stages you don't exactly have an exact picture of what that's going to be. So can be valuable, but I wouldn't over optimize around that, would be my advice.
Cool. Another one from the chat. Maybe I can take that one. I'm not too silent. How do you see solo founders, companies with great teams behind them? So yeah, definitely would look into solo founders as well. So it's not like a big no-go area for us. Generally think though that starting a company is a very long process, and running a company a very long process can be very isolating. So would encourage still people to team up with people they have a good working relationship with or have a history working together. But it's not a roadblock for us to invest in you if you're just a solo founder. Definitely seen like historically that companies that were started by two or three people, yeah, often had better outcomes than if it's just a solo founder. It's my 2 cents. Any other questions? 1 second.
We can also take questions live too if people
Yeah,
want
maybe.
to.
Yeah, if you want to
You
verbally ask,
type
that's
in.
fine as well.
Yep.
And people just want to raise their hands and I can unmute them.
Oh, there's one.
Yeah, so Steven first.
Yeah, so thank you. Excellent presentation. A lot of very helpful information here. I'm curious whether in the very early stages, whether you've found that business competitions, innovation challenges are helpful in getting to that first seed funding.
They can be. A lot of the time, I find those types of competitions and stuff can be a bit distracting and not incentivizing the right things to actually be focusing on. Definitely in like the business school type competition things, I would often feel that's the case. But I mean, some of them do come with, cash prizes that can be useful for starting a company and whatnot. So I think just being like selective about those types of things and also aware of like how much of a time sink they might be is really important. But yeah, sometimes at the early stages, things like that can be good to do.
Cool. And Amanda is next.
Thanks so much for putting this on, and your presentation is really helpful. I have a question for those of us that are in areas where investors usually stay away from, like infectious disease, for example. How do you go about fundraising in a space that historically investors don't like investing in?
Yeah. So this is like infectious disease, I think, is a great category of example for like the alternative types of investors beyond VC to consider at early stages. So things like family offices or high net worth individuals that might be, super mission aligned and like, publicly aware that this is like an underfunded area where, often there might not be the same type of market dynamics that make sense. Foundations, I think, can often be good funders for this type of work as well. So yeah, definitely it can be harder to map all of that out than, just a bunch of VC funds, but definitely like looking beyond just the traditional venture capital types of avenues, I think is important in those types of instances. And for what it's worth, like my company Conception, like definitely started at a point where it didn't make sense for normal VC at the very beginning. And this is how I went about it. I found a bunch of high net worth folks to cut initial checks basically, and then started to supplement that with some VC checks as well. So yeah, I think you need to be creative in those types of situations. It definitely doesn't make your life easier, but it's not a deal breaker for something that could be really high impact as well.
Well,
Uh, yeah.
next is Samuel.
Oh, I think you're muted still.
Uh,
Oh,
Still
sorry, your
muted.
audio is not working. Maybe Rob Yang.
Yeah. Samuel, you can put your question in the chat if you want. We can do next.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation and information. My question is about looking for the VCs. Do you go after VCs who had previously funded your competitors? Is that like what are your thoughts about that?
Lucas, do you want to take that?
I would say early on, you should probably try and avoid it or at least have a frank conversation about it. It becomes quite common for later stage investment where people, I'm talking like, crossover and, later Series C or Series D, where people are making more modality or disease area specific bets. But early stage, where there's relatively concentrated portfolios, there's not going to be, really great firewalls in like a small fund. So I would be cautious about it. I wouldn't say it's just an immediate, deal breaker, but have a frank conversation about it with them around how they're thinking about the space and yeah, just be open with them that you have concerns about it. Isaac, you want to go or Matt, did we get the question in the chat?
Oh, someone asked about how do you source emails for cold outreach? What's a good tool here, but good strategy?
So there's this thing, Rocket Reach, that like if you find people's LinkedIn, you can then search through it to like try and get email addresses. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes I'll just like straight up try to guess people's email addresses. There's like email address validator tools that can be useful for that. But yeah, I mean, definitely it can be like a research digging project, like make the list of all the emails you might need. Yeah, Apollo is similar to Rocket Reach and is also a good one. But yeah.
Cool. Let's do Damon next.
Thanks for the great presentation. I'm just wondering, for a company like ours, we have spun out from the university for almost a year, and we raised a very small amount of money, but still believe that joining this fellowship with up to $1 million support can be very helpful and pushing to the following up milestones and create great value. Just wondering whether you would recommend us to apply this fellowship program, or you think it might not be a good fit in this case. Thank you.
Yeah, no, definitely you should apply. That still sounds very much in the sweet spot of things.
Thanks.
Cool. Carrie?
Yeah, so I'd like to know how you prefer how you prefer to understand or how the right team can be built, especially like during an introduction meeting and or presentation. What do you prefer to see?
What do you mean by how the right team can be built?
So you mentioned early on that early on you want to have the investors want to have confidence that the right team will be built in order to build out the company and most certainly move things forward, at least incrementally.
Yeah.
How is that demonstrated to you? How do you prefer, what sort of information do you prefer to see outside of seeing somebody's resume?
Yeah, I mean, putting it simply, it's being able to engage with the person and have an easy conversation about why what they're working on is a high potential thing, and that founder has kind of thought through everything that's reasonable to think through at this point as to, why it's worth doing and what the challenges with what they're doing might be, and why, this is a special enough idea to really pursue in light of what anyone else might be doing. So yeah, it is like trying to like take all of that as a proxy for a belief that, this is like a very solid, competent founder, and that's going to be like, thoughtful about building these things out into the future. But there's often like not that much to go on at these early stages beyond those initial types of conversations. And maybe there's some like very preliminary data that, someone that has been working in like a research context or something like that can show prior to starting their company. But a lot of it is like feeling based and like trying to like construct like a good conversation and a good rapport basically between investor and potential founder like from the very get-go.
But I think it's definitely worth highlighting too that it is very subtle things that investors are looking at. So everything's under scrutiny, even if they don't seem like they're super engaged in the meeting. They're looking for, if you have a co-founder, how you're passing things off between the two of you, what kind of questions each person's answering, on emails, like, are you, as Matt mentioned, are you responding, within 2 minutes or within 2 hours is a significant difference. So you should really be going into each of these interactions as, every single detail is being scrutinized very heavily, and little subtle things can really, send investors to the door.
Thank you.
Great. Should we do Vidya next, please?
Hi, thank you so much. So my question relates to, I have an idea, but to build out anything, to hire the lab space or to hire the team, I'm going to need some funds. And also there is a risk involved with my quitting the current job and dedicating myself to a startup fully. So is it possible to get some kind of assurance on some kind of funding so I can at least have my salary kind of money coming to support my family in the time that I'm working on the startup, and also to say hire a team or a small lab space and so on?
Alex, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, in your case, sort of what I'm understanding, but maybe correct me, looking for like a commitment of like, yeah, maybe pre-seed capital to get started, to basically support yourselves and sort of get things set up. I mean, that situation might be useful to, yeah, look for accelerator programs, like, for example, what we're doing with SciFounder Fellowship that comes with this early starting capital, or maybe approach angels first, really to set up the base, and from there, and after having raised maybe a few $100,000, from there we starting a fuller, larger fundraise. So you have that security in the bank, so to say. Did that answer your question, or yeah, does that make sense?
But maybe to be
Yes,
more
thank
direct too, startups are risky, right? And you need to, be comfortable with that risk. And so investors early on too are going to be, again, sensitive to things that, yeah, if people are kind of like waffling on it, or, oh, if I have the capital. So that's kind of the reality of startups. And if, kind of consistent salary is really what kind of the thing that you're optimizing for is, it may be that startups are not the right path to go down.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, thank you. And from the answer that Alex gave me, a couple of things I gathered is one is angel investors and the other one is accelerators.
Yeah, that would be a good fit to
Okay,
explore.
okay, thank you so much.
All right, let's do Wei next.
Hi, good morning. Hi. So my question is, what is your ideal outcome? Like by running the fellowship or a fund, what is your objective? What does super success, like the best outcome looks like to you, for you?
Yeah. So for us specifically, you mean? I mean, we're a bit different in that, we really started SciFounders with the goal of trying to get more scientists starting companies that we think are really high impact. There's definitely like a meta aspect beyond just the idea of making money, that we're trying to enable change in the world to try and get more really interesting technologies to get developed properly with teams that can be really great at, building that out long term. So if what we're doing helps catalyze, folks like you to be able to like be more successful at developing really interesting technologies, like that's really exciting to us. It's the prime motivator here. I think it's nice for us in that sense too, that like, at least in Lucas, in my cases, like we have companies outside of this that we're operating. And so it allows us to have that like touch point of like the mission orientation, even like more central in our minds here. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the companies we're trying to back specifically as well, though, like we are trying to back, things that we believe can be like really, really big outcomes in terms of the impact they have. So, things that, I don't know, what would be an example? Something that might only help like a couple of academic labs, for example, like for like a product building out, like that's not going to be super interesting to us, honestly, versus like something that can like, cure a disease or, change the way, laboratories work writ large around the world. Like those are the types of stuff that like get us more excited in general. That's again going to be true, I think, for probably most venture capitalist type of investors, but there might be some out there that are cooler with like the smaller opportunities as well.
Thank you. That makes sense. Thank you.
For sure.
Should we do Satvik next?
Hi, Matt. Thanks for the presentation. It was great. I just had a quick question. I know, like you mentioned, with the cycle, like, kind of changing and with, like, a lot of investors looking at, products in the pipeline and stuff like that. I have an idea for like a health tech startup, but that's more of like a software platform. So I was just wondering, like, how do you envision, challenges around perhaps raising funding for that as opposed to like, investors that may be more interested in like, more like hard assets or like lab-based biotech companies?
Yeah, I mean that type of again, like very generically speaking, because I don't know the details of what you're considering working on, but often those types of companies have the beneficial feature that like it's really opening the door to software investors as well to be considering.
Mm.
So in some ways, that's like a pretty favorable position. Obviously, like software at this point, and with everything that's changing, with AI foundation models and how startups are approaching different things, like there's a lot more competition there and a lot more concern about like what are long-term enduring like value creation opportunities. So again, I don't know specifically what you're working on, but
Yeah, I can tell you this, Matt. Like,
yeah.
ideally, it's using it like ML as well. Like, it's very machine learning based. So, primarily to do with like preventative for respiratory illnesses. So that's why I was just curious. Yeah, in terms of exploring like at least as software investors as a potential avenue as opposed to biotech investors.
Yeah, I mean, definitely like traditional biotech investors probably would not be a fit for you. Maybe folks like us that like kind of, sit in between Silicon Valley and more traditional biotech investors could be interesting. But like, yeah, I would focus more on like that vertical folks like software investors generally.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yep.
Well, let's do one more and then we right about time. Last one is Isaac.
Hi, yes. So my question, thank you for hosting this. My question is if we're in a situation where, say, we have a really long runway and we get into a conversation with an investor, a potential investor, can we do is setting up something where like I've got a couple milestones that I could show you first and hold off on the investment until I show you that milestone. Is that a thing that we can use as leverage to increase interest? And are there any strategies to like, you know, sell that idea? Like, do you put that in your pitch deck? Like, if that's the case.
So you're saying like establish you're going to go after some milestone and don't ask for investment until you hit that milestone?
Well, but no. So say like I have milestones already that I know that I can reach. Is that like a strategy to like say, hey, like I'm happy to take an investment after I've shown this milestone. Let's try and make a commitment here.
I'm not sure I like fully understand what you mean, but like two things come to mind. One, like the aspect of what I was saying earlier of like relationship building over time is definitely beneficial if you have that luxury. So like yeah, like building rapport with investors for consideration later. The other thing that happens sometimes is what's called a tranched round. So often that'll be like an investor will make like an overall commitment for a certain amount of money, potentially at one valuation, potentially at multiple valuations, but like that'll be split up over, unlocking certain amounts of that based off of milestones you're making automatically. So it sounds like what you're describing would be more like a tranched round, but like it's not typical to like agree to that like just off the tranche coming later versus like there being some tranche immediately first and then something unlocking later afterwards. Otherwise, most investors would probably want to wait till later. There is what's called as well, like what an uncapped safe note. So yeah, we didn't really get into this, but like there's like price rounds versus like safe notes for doing an investment, and like an unpriced safe note basically is just like a placeholder for money to come in at whatever valuation you raise money at later. So like if you're like a really hot company, sometimes that happens, but like that's super, super founder friendly and is very abnormal for investors to do that in most instances.